Okay. Well, may I say welcome to everybody for joining this NCIS webinar. I'm Amanda Haste. I'm currently serving as president of NCIS, and we are delighted to welcome Phillip Reid, who is a maritime historian, and he was joint winner of the Eisenstein Prize in 2021 for a very good article. And he is going to speak to us today about the nuts and bolts of maritime research, which I'm very much looking forward to because it's touching on my own research. So welcome, Phillip. The
Thank
stage
you.
is yours.
Okay, thanks, Amanda. And thanks to everybody who turned up for this. Let me begin by acknowledging that the research I'm going to talk about has so far been supported twice by NCIS, once with a research grant in July of 2020, and once with a special research grant in March of 2021. Both were for work on the book project I completed at the end of last year, which is now in the hands of the publisher and should be out next spring. Since 2012, I've been exploring the ordinary merchant ship operating in the 17th and 18th century British Atlantic, by which I mean the North Atlantic from Western Europe and Great Britain to the North American mainland, down to the Caribbean Sea, and including the Gulf of Mexico. I work from the perspective of the history of technology, which seeks to understand a people's use of technology as situated in their culture. After a decade, while I'm not ready to abandon this subject, I am ready to expand on it and branch out from it. So this seems like an appropriate moment to reflect back on what I've learned, how I learned it, and what I'd still like to know. Having said that, I am not assuming that any of you have any particular interest in this subject, and so this presentation will focus on research methodology and the larger questions about the human experience raised by this sort of work. I'll start by sketching out why I found this subject interesting in the first place. To a significant extent, it's a part of a broad and abiding interest in maritime history in general. I finished my master's in that specialty 24 years ago and my PhD in it in 2017. Maritime history has been a functioning academic specialty since the late 1980s, and while its prospects as such have at times been in doubt, at present I would say that it is growing, especially in the context of global history, emphasizing connections and networks, and further working to dismantle the historical distortions of nationalism so dominant in the late 19th and throughout the 20th centuries. Maritime history is closely related to maritime or nautical archaeology, though the relationship between the two has not proved as cooperative and thus intellectually fruitful as was hoped by the scholars who founded the joint program at East Carolina University, from which so many of us in the field have emerged. It almost goes without saying that maritime history is a big umbrella. It is the story of past human use of and life on navigable water. Anyone working in it must specialize in some aspect of it to make a meaningful contribution. The vast majority of people working on specifically technological aspects of it are archaeologists. I am not, so I'm a rather odd duck. While still a doctoral candidate, though, I discovered the history of technology specialty and instantly felt a strong pull in that direction. It didn't take me long to realize this would make a good intellectual home for me. Histotechno came into its own around the same time as maritime history, and its primary accomplishment so far has been to situate technology in culture, serving as a strong antidote to teleological modernist assumptions about progress and the oversimplified linear model of history that goes with that. While risking an oversimplification myself, I will sum up this decades-long effort by saying that the history of technology specialty has done a thorough job of debunking the fallacious aphorism, form follows function. The study of technological choice before what we call the industrial age, with its mass production and mass marketing, creating demand for its products, is, I've argued, particularly important in our own time, given that our perception of the history of technology is profoundly distorted by the pace of innovation driven by the semiconductor and the silicon chip. Digital technology has, in colloquial English, become synonymous with technology itself. As David Edgerton points out in The Shock of the Old, most people no longer consider a hammer to be technology. It is, though, and for that matter, so is the idea of a hammer and the knowledge of how to make it. Our world, Edgerton demonstrates, still runs on old technology, but we have grafted the digital computer onto so much of it, from the internal combustion engine to the kitchen refrigerator to the reproduction of high-fidelity sound, that we obscure that fact, and we conflate the ever-accelerating pace of innovation in digital technology with the pace of technological innovation writ large. Our perception of the history of technology is distorted by not just a strong sense of hyper-innovation, but an assigning of value to hyper-innovation. We tend to assume that innovation is an absolute good and the absence of it is a fault. What we might call technological conservatism goes against the very grain of our technological values, regardless of whatever practical merit it might be able to claim for itself. This state of affairs presents challenges to our own society for sure, but it also challenges our ability to understand other people's use of and approach to technology. And that in turn makes it more difficult for us to work through the challenges posed by our own subjective assumptions about technology in our own world. The primary purpose of studying history is not as a cautionary tale for the present. Most professional historians would push back pretty hard against the old saw, those who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. Without getting into the limitations of that, I will say that the primary purpose of history should be the advancement of empathy. The more we understand about past peoples, the more we understand about being human in general. And since we're all human, that's inherently worthwhile. That said, a better understanding of pre-industrial history of technology does offer us a pair of glasses with which we might overcome the blurriness and myopia caused by digital hyper-innovation, combined with the strong vestiges of modernist assumptions about inevitable linear progress and the idea that technology is a core component of the project of human perfectibility. The early modern British Atlantic merchant ship was easily as important as any other technology in creating and sustaining, for better or worse, the Atlantic world headquartered in London. As such, it was representative of a larger European enterprise. Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, France, to a lesser extent Sweden and Denmark, also engaged in Atlantic colonization. The aggregate results of this Western European enterprise make up the very world in which we have all grown up. Yet in general histories of technology and even general histories of the ship, this technology is considered rather static. It is quickly glossed over between longer discussions of the development of the Western European ocean-going ship in the earlier period used by the explorers and conquerors, and the later developments of both the clipper ships of the mid-19th century and the development of commercially viable steamships at the same time. At some point in 2012, the question occurred to me, if this technology was static, how did it serve a world of such dynamic growth and change? To pursue an answer to that question, I'd have to go well beyond the existing literature on the subject. Unlike naval vessels, ordinary merchant ships tended to leave scant records. They were usually built by eye, using knowledge and sensibilities stored in the shipwright's brain, not on paper. Some published treatises on shipbuilding were widely circulated, but that doesn't mean their prescriptions were followed in ordinary yards around the Atlantic. The burden of proof of that is on the investigator. The correspondence of ship-owning merchants seldom mentions technical matters. Most of those were left up to the shipwright. Exceptions tended to omit justification or explanation for an owner's stated preference or opinion. Then there is the simple fact that the vast majority of academic historians do not possess the technical understanding to grasp, let alone explain, this complex technology. The principles of physics and mathematics applicable to ship design and construction are so sophisticated that not even the best minds of the 18th century, including Newton, Euler, and Bouguer, were able to figure them out well enough to have practical application on artisanal shipwrightry before 1800. As for the archaeological remains, while there is no gainsaying their importance in advancing our knowledge over the past half-century, the Atlantic is not kind to the remains of wooden vessels. A typical period wreck site contains nothing more of the hull than the central area of the bottom and some scattered artifacts, if that. It is the aggregate of such evidence that allows the educated conjecture upon which archaeologists rely to interpret such material. Even so, among academics, archaeologists were doing all the work on this technology. The rest of it was going on outside the academy by curators, serious ship modelers, and by those who design, build, and operate carefully researched operating period replicas. Bringing together all of this work and whatever insights it might have to offer, and meshing it with the important maritime economic history written over the past half century would be necessary to advance our understanding of the subject. So that is what I set out to do. A dissertation, 2 books, and several articles later, I can say I've had some success, and I have a good bead on where work on this subject needs to go from here, whether I do it or somebody else does. As I get into the nuts and bolts of how one goes about conducting research on this subject, let me start by stating what shouldn't surprise you, given the last paragraph. This is by necessity not only an interdisciplinary, but an extra-disciplinary effort. The researcher is in the position of a serious investigative journalist who needs to understand enough about the subject to talk to experts from different fields who are asking different questions for different reasons, interpret their answers, which means weighing them against sometimes contradictory evidence from other sources, and reach defensible, if tentative, conclusions from all of it. Those conclusions must then in turn be presented to an audience of students of history in language both accurate and comprehensible to the reader with no technical background. Since I come out of academic history, I'll start with the archives. The most important sources are merchant owners' correspondence, especially building contracts with shipwrights and correspondence between owners and shipmasters, the logs of vessels, and legal documents associated with maritime litigation. Plans and specifications may sometimes be found in owners' papers, but it's rare. What's most valuable in those papers are bills and invoices, letters of agreement, and letters to and from masters that reveal costs, equipment, details of vessels under construction or repair, sailing instructions from owners to masters, and reports from masters back to owners on the operation of the vessel and the ship's business. Logs are the day-to-day records kept in more or less standardized form and legally required of the vessel's operation at sea and in port. They contain details of course and speed, weather conditions, sail changes, damage and repairs, and noteworthy events, including those involving personnel. Surviving vessel logs from this period are numerous, though, as is always the case, more so from the 18th century than the 17th. Legal records can provide details of cargoes carried, accidents, personnel, technical specifications of vessels, equipment carried aboard, and monetary values. Merchant owners and mariners were fairly litigious, so there are volumes of such cases, especially given the fact that during wartime, merchant prizes were taken by enemy predators, and such cases were often adjudicated in maritime courts. What's required to use all of these records is developing the ability to read period script, understand the common abbreviations and notations they used, and transcribe the documents. Facility with them is highly dependent on a technical background adequate for understanding what one is reading. Someone who was adept at transcribing, say, 18th century political correspondence would have a steep learning curve trying to transcribe a ship's log. The transcriber is constantly presented with nearly illegible words and characters and judgment calls to make. The process is, in my experience, highly instructive, requiring side trips to expert consultants and looking up places on Google Maps. My grasp of Atlantic maritime geography was already solid. Spending months in transcription filled in a significant amount of detail. Outside the archives, one must make good use of the archaeological record, which means having a basic understanding of marine archaeology, how it works, and its corpus of discoveries pertinent to the subject. Curators and ship modelers know a lot about hulls, rigs, and equipment. Their own research experience into technical matters is a deep wellspring. As for the designers, builders, and operators of period replicas, I believe them to be the most underutilized resource on the subject. And accordingly, I have spent much time chasing them down and getting them to have serious conversations with me. While it is important to go into such work with a clear understanding of the principles and potential pitfalls of experimental archaeology, the experience of these people is still the closest we can get to the experience of their predecessors. None of these source types is anything close to comprehensive. Even combined, they fall short of that. But taken together, they have convinced me that the merchant ship remained viable in its changing operating environment through incremental adaptation and the persistence of strong continuities in proven characteristics that offered owners and shippers the best cost-effective risk mitigation technology for a perennially dangerous operating environment. For the final section of this, I want to focus on work on some specific projects and the results of that. First is what I've long called the Sultana Project, which led to my second monograph, The Boston Schooner in the Royal Navy, 1768 to 1772, Commerce and Conflict in Maritime British America, which will be published by Boydell and Brewer early next year. I have yet to be successful in winning any major grants, the kind that actually pay you to work, so I've needed to choose projects whose source material is accessible to me. The 2 research visits for this project to Chestertown, Maryland, to go through 4 years of logbooks for His Majesty's schooner Sultana were funded by the Early American Industries Association, NCIS, the Society for Nautical Research in the UK, and in a pinch, by friends and family through a GoFundMe campaign. The original logbooks are held by the National Archives of the UK, which are not accessible to me, but the Sultana Education Foundation, which owns and operates a careful replica of the original, has complete copies in their private collection, which they let me use. Sultana was officially a naval vessel. She was built as an ordinary small merchant schooner of a type ubiquitous in the British Atlantic by that time. Studying her design and operation at the level of detail permitted by this source material offered the opportunity to write a microhistory of a vessel working during a specific set of years for which we happen to have the best commercial records from the entire history of British North America before the War of American Independence. I was able to supplement the logbooks with selected digital copies of documents held by the National Archives, whose page finding and copying services are effective, well-run, and reasonably priced, as long as you aren't looking for a high volume of material. Even if a researcher were to need several $100s worth of digital images, however, that is an expense for which it might be possible to secure funding, and it would be far cheaper than going to London from the US. Having worked through Sultana's logbooks and honed by subject-specific transcription skills, I answered a general call in 2020 from Professor Guido Abatista at the University of Trieste in Italy, principal investigator of the Global Sea Routes Database Project. The GSR project is attempting nothing less than to create a database of every transoceanic voyage undertaken by Europeans and European colonies from 1500 to 1900, based on vessel logs. I was asked to join a proposed expanded team subject to the award of a major grant from the European Research Council, which unfortunately was unsuccessful. But in the meantime, I was taught how to use the database and was able to enter Sultana's 2 transatlantic voyages into the geoplotting application, resulting in full plots of those voyages I will be using as illustrations in the book. I am hopeful that more will come of my involvement with GSR. Updates since I wrote this, the editor has indicated to me that he is not satisfied with the quality of these images, so maybe they won't be in the book, but they're right here and they're really cool, so I'm glad to be able to show them to you. In fact, more already has come of my involvement with GSR. Professor Abatista secured for me a high-resolution digital copy of the log of the American Snow George from November of 1805 to August of 1806. I transcribed the log and in the process realized that it had a far more compelling story to tell than I had expected. Of an American vessel braving the violent Atlantic, the observations of an American businessman in Ireland, an opportunistic slaving voyage gone wrong in the Caribbean, resulting in the seizure and condemnation of the vessel by the Royal Navy, and the necessity of the author's returning home on another vessel, a voyage he also recorded. This is a story of the devilish difficulty of doing business for American ships during the Napoleonic Wars, with the Royal Navy able to exert its will over neutral commerce and very little recourse available to US interests, except appeal to the fairness of the British Admiralty courts. In the George's case, as shown by the legal records I obtained from the National Archives, those courts declined to rule in George's owner's favor. He lost both the vessel and any profit he might have realized from her voyage. I will be drawing on the George logbook for my contribution to a special issue of the journal Itinerario, highlighting the work of the GSR project and the diverse applications of ship's logs as historical sources. I also plan to work up an article specifically focused on the voyages of the George in the context of their time and place, relying on the logs supplemented by the legal records and sources descriptive of the places the American vessel visited, from Wilmington, Delaware to Cork, Ireland, to St. Thomas and Jamaica in the Caribbean. This is another project for which I was able to obtain source material digitally and work on at home, making an otherwise impossible project doable. I have 2 grant applications now pending. The first is to continue archival research on comparative building and manning costs of different common merchant types used for the same purposes. This would further test my hypothesis, based on work so far, that technological choices between vessel types were primarily based on cost control, as opposed to vessel performance. If funded, this work would result in a journal article. The second application is for a National Endowment of the Humanities Fellowship to work on a maritime history of colonial North Carolina, which, believe it or not, has never been written. NEH fellowships are almost absurdly hard to get, with roughly a 7% success rate. So of course, I'm not betting on that. I will be applying for an American Council of Learned Societies Fellowship for the same project in September, which would also be sufficient to fund the research and is also similarly difficult to win. Finally, I have agreed to join another European project contingent upon winning a long-term ERC grant notification in December, exploring shipping between North America and the Caribbean from 1750 to 1850. I will be presenting on the Sultana project at the annual conference of the North American Society for Oceanic History, which is here in Wilmington next week. And if funding is forthcoming, at the annual meeting of the American Historical Association in Philadelphia in January 2023, for which I have helped put together a panel on what ship microhistories have to teach us. I'm not sure how long I'll get to remain a practicing scholar after this year, but I'm proud of what I've been able to accomplish in the 5 years since I finished my doctorate. And I'm grateful to those individuals and organizations, NCIS prominent among them, who have made that possible. I have to hope that the work results in something remunerative sooner rather than later. Meanwhile, I've done the best I can, and you have helped, so thank you.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating.
Thank you. Glad some of you were here and enjoyed it.
Certainly, I have written so many questions, but may I ask anybody that has a question to either raise their hand? I see Joan's, oh, she's clapping. Put the little hand thing up, or put your question in the chat, and then we can ask Phil to comment on them. While we're waiting for other people, Yvonne, you're muted.
I'm unmuted. Hello.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Hi. First of all, Philip, kudos on a marvelous presentation. I mean, really, really
Thank you.
Useful and interesting, and it's the whole package. And I wish you very good luck in your future.
Thank you. I could use it.
Yes. I don't. Well, I have a brief question, which I'll just throw out, and you can come back to it later. Which is whether or not you've looked into any of the, or had any experience with the work that's being done on the logs of the slave ships and all of that whole field of endeavor, and whether or not that has any interesting cross-referencing with your maritime work.
The slave aspect of it, I have two things that I think I should say about that. One is, in the field, no matter what angle of it you're working on, if you're working in the 17th and 18th century Atlantic, it's central. You can't get away from it. You shouldn't try. You should acknowledge that. And just kind of, you have to just be aware, like look for it. It's so central to the economy and to the society that you just have to keep that in mind at all times. Having said that, I don't work on it myself. It is beyond fashionable in the field, in the discipline. Basically, it's like if you want money and you're working on slavery, you probably get some. And so those of us who don't work on it and don't work on really work that focuses on other traditionally marginalized people, we get the crumbs that come off the table if we're lucky. That's just reality. That's how things are. As far as what I would tell people, that's worth knowing, there's this huge repository called the Atlantic Slave Trade Database.
That's what I was.
And anyone working actively on slavery knows this, but people who may not, may not. That's the project that's still ongoing. That's attempting to just give us the whole thing, you know, the whole record of the trade. And the last time I looked, they had gotten to the point where they're telling us that the total number of prisoners transported is approaching 13 million. So that count keeps ticking up. So you just have to kind of keep up with it. But what we tell people now is, you know, 12 to 13 million. There are plenty of people who have worked on specifically on slave voyages. Robert Harms, who's going to be chairing our panel at AHA this year, wrote The Worlds of the Diligent, A Voyage Through the Slave Trade. It's a wonderful book based on, and it's a micro history like mine in the sense that it's based on one vessel, one long voyage, as a, you know, microcosm of something bigger. That book's been out for quite a while, probably close to 20 years. That's a really good one. A lot of people know Marcus Rediker. He's worked a lot on the slave trade, wrote a book called The Slave Ship, Human History. Emma Christopher has written a book on the slave ship. There's good stuff out there. And, you know, the last thing it frankly needs is me. But it's a thriving thing. And I think, you know, the part of it that interests me specifically, of course, is the technological aspect of it. Yeah. And I think what you see is you definitely see some technological ramifications of the British law that came in late, that we always associate with that very successful piece of propaganda that was based around that visual image of the Brooks. Everybody's seen it, may not know it's the Brooks, but that image of the slaves packed below deck on a, you know, inside an outline of a hull. That was used to lobby Parliament very successfully. And when the British Parliament passed this set of regulations late in the slave trade, you do see some technological adaptations as a result of that. And that's something we as moderns would expect. We're used to that. Regulations have technological ramifications all the time. You can't get away from that. So that's one thing that's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is once it's illegal, then you also see a pretty significant technological shift, because of course, once it becomes illegal, then it's smuggling, right? So then it goes from a legal trade where you can use, where you're not trying to hide it, to smuggling. And when you're smuggling, you need to get away with it. So then is when you start seeing all these fast schooners coming into the slave trade, what we call here in the East Coast of the United States, the Baltimore Clippers. Those were slavers. They were illegal slavers. And the whole point was, you're not trying to carry a big cargo anymore. You're not, that's too risky. You're not trying to go get 200 people and bring them across the Atlantic and, you know, throw 50 of them overboard after they die or whatever, which they did all the time. You're trying to get a smaller cargo and get them as fast as possible to the Caribbean and not get caught, because you're trying to get through that Royal Navy blockade. And so technologically, we do see a big shift into what I would just say is, you know, sort of a smuggling mode once it becomes illegal, and a shift away from what the crew of Sultana, the interceptor that I just wrote this book about, would have seen. And it's interesting, and I say this in the book, there is zero mention of slavery in the entire 4.5 years of logs of Sultana. And this is a vessel that is interdicting American merchant commerce up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States. And I say in there, why would she mention it? She's not interested in slavers. Slavers aren't smuggling. So, you know, slave trade is legal. So why would this vessel bother, you know, stopping slavers? Yeah. So it's a completely different world once the British, and then fought, you know, shortly thereafter, the United States outlawed the transatlantic slave trade in 1807, 1808. Oh, well, now this is illegal. So now we're going to shift completely how we go about doing it. And that's what we see.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Shelby, you have a question.
Yeah, I was impressed, well, with the whole presentation, but when you were talking about transcribing logs, transcribing notes, so on and so forth, and showed us those handwritten sheets. I was confronted with the same thing on a project dealing with Connecticut laws. And it took two of us, because we would do it together, read it out loud, and then we'd have to make judgment calls on what a smudge meant.
Right.
So I really take my hat off to you, because that stuff is difficult.
It's hard.
Yeah, and when you deal with names from the 17th and 18th century, you're in a whole other world. I mean, it is Strangeville. So anyway, thank you very much for pointing out the difficulty of that particular task.
Sure. And you know, that means that when you read something that's based on transcriptions, you are trusting the judgment of that historian. What I realized when I learned to transcribe it, you know, and I knew that Shelby had done this kind of work because he told me, but what I realized is like, oh, you can't just decide you're a transcriber, you know, because without the subject matter knowledge, it's not going to work. You know, you can, yes, there are technical skills to transcribing. Actually, the Science History Institute in Philadelphia did a series of seminars on transcription last year that was really good. I hope they do more. I actually applied to teach one based on this experience using those sources. And I hope it comes to something. But it was a super good idea because they did go through some of the tips and tricks that are kind of universally applicable, like knowing common 18th and 17th century abbreviations, for example. Those are somewhat standard. What's devilishly not standard is them and the way they write. They almost seems like they take perverse pleasure in never spelling the same thing the same way twice. You know, they love to use different forms of, and it almost seems gratuitous where you're reading a log with numbers in it, not even letters, just numbers, but they'll, you know, abbreviate like degrees or the way they're writing what's obviously a number and a decimal. Well, in the first one, it's a decimal. In the second one, it's a space. In the third one, it's a dash. In the fourth one, it's 2 dashes. And they don't care. They just don't care. And they don't care if they don't spell the same thing. It makes you realize how standard we are, how formal and almost rigid are. And I love it, you know, because it makes communication easier. They don't care. They just write whatever they want, and you have to figure it out.
Phillip,
what I also found was helpful was, as I said, I alluded to having an expert consultant. What I really was valuable was when I was reading the log of her coming down the English Channel. Of course, that whole progress is done by sighting on landmarks and knowing where you are in relation to those landmarks. They're not taking sun positions. They don't need to. They're inside of land, and they're inside of very familiar land. But it's not familiar to me. So I don't know what the Dodman is, and I don't know what the old church light on Beachy Head, you know, all this stuff. And so I have a guy that has mentored me that we've got an article co-authored coming out in the Mariners Mirror this summer sometime. He is from Kent. And even though he's lived in Australia since the 70s, he was raised in the south of England. And so he knows all those things on the English Channel. And I could just throw him this ridiculous sounding nonsense word. What is this? And he's like, oh, that's the church at this place or whatever. And it was gold.
I found that when I was doing research, I had to wear, the architects use them, magnifying glasses around your head, in order not only to read the handwritten stuff, but when we would get to newspaper reports, and we're reading microwave newspapers and holding them out like this. Now, what the hell is that?
That's what's so beautiful about high resolution digital images on a 24-inch monitor. I can blow these things up as big as I want, and they're so much easier to read than the original document that you're better off with the copy. All you need is someone to do a decent job of making, and they know what they're doing. In all of the stuff that I've used, there was exactly 2 pages that were blurry. And I just contacted the archive and I said, hey, this is a great resource. 2 of these pages, the photo just, the camera crapped out on you, blurred it, whatever. Sent me 2 new ones. I'm on my way. And so, and I've worked with the originals. The originals are, you're sitting in this at the table and you've got the original thing on the foam board laid out, and you're killing yourself. And as Shelby said, if you don't have a magnifying glass, you're screwed.
Mm-hmm.
He's smart to use the ones on your face. I've used this cheap little one that you hold up, it's like a floppy sheet. I've done that, and I've done. Now at home I call it the geezer reader. It's this gooseneck magnifier on a stand that sits on the floor, and you can bend it over and put it where you want and turn the light on. If you don't have something, forget it. You're not going to be able to make those little calls on the smudgy thing or the thing where he ran out of room and just ran it all together, whatever.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Those practicalities of getting the data from the research, really important. Sue Johnson, can I ask you to put your question, please, to Philip?
Yes, Philip, you were having great difficulty, I think, getting information from such as the UK National Archives. And I just wondered if you use their catalogue system, the Discovery catalogue system, if you can identify the information you're looking for, they can sometimes send you a transcription or even a photocopy of documents that you're looking for. And also Lloyd's lists, Lloyd's of London, do they help at all? Is there anything in the archives that helps in any way?
Well, first of all, obviously, I didn't communicate clearly about my experience with TNA. I have had wonderful success getting stuff from them through their catalog. When I say they're not accessible to me, it just means that I can't go there. And when I'm talking about big documents, like it took me months to get through Sultana's logs. And so those aren't accessible because, even 20 years ago, to have the entire logs copied by the National Archives for SEF. Drew said, if I recall correctly, I think that cost about $8,000, and that was 20 years ago. So it's not accessible geographically, it's not accessible mostly financially. It's wonderful if you need a letter, if you need a few things, because not only can you get them, and they're good at that, they're wonderful. Their catalog is excellent. They will answer questions. If it's not clear what you're looking for, you can ask them, and they will a lot of times know. And their instructions are so clear. It's very clear if you take a little time to read. Hey, you need to tell us where we're looking exactly, because we get 15 minutes to do a page check. So that's the only time we're allowed to go to the stacks and look at this thing and find what you're looking for. So be as specific as possible about what you need. And for me, that's usually just, please find me a letter from so-and-so to so-and-so on this date this year. And that's all they need. They can go right to it. They say, yes, it's there. Do you want it? Yes. And they tell you how many pages it is. So it's not a mystery. Are you spending $16 or $100? That's not a mystery. They know and they tell you. So it's wonderful if you need a small amount of material. If you need a bunch of material, or you need, you're not exactly sure, you need to go through a bunch of stuff to see, what's there. That's not practical. It's when you know exactly what you want that it's very accessible to get digital copies from them, and it's affordable. And then you can go back and say, to a small organization like NCIS or SNR, you can say, hey, I spent X amount of money on copies for this purpose, and they have money in place to reimburse you for that. So you can even get it paid for, which is lovely. But what I meant to say was, if you need to actually do sit down research, then you either need to, and I have done this. I got a grant from SNR for my first book to do this. You need to hire somebody to go in there for you and find stuff, or you need to go yourself, and that's big money. So they're wonderful. They're wonderful for what they can do for you if you already know what you're looking for. As for Lloyd's List, there is no, those things are gold. There's no gainsaying that. They get a lot more comprehensive in terms of their usefulness late in the 18th century, after registration becomes standard, which I believe is in the late 1780s. Before then, it's not, you know, it's still useful, but it's not as useful. But yes, that is a treasure trove of stuff. And if you are trying to find a specific vessel and any information about it, Lloyd's List is, you know, one of the best places you can look. And Lloyd's Foundation has done a ton with a lot. I mean, how much money can they have, y'all? I mean, they've been in the insurance business for 400 years, and they still are. So their foundation is very well endowed and has done wonderful work to make stuff available. They've got archivists and people on staff. They're putting out stuff, public programs, all sorts of stuff. Lloyd's Foundation is going for it.
Philip, all the best to you and to your research, and I hope you get some funding from somewhere. Very well done.
Me too. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm wondering how practical it is. For instance, if you wanted something from the National Archives in London, how practical is it to get somebody else? How much of an expert do they have to be in the field? Because sometimes you don't know what you want until somebody's actually going through the actual dossiers. But we actually are looking at instigating a couple more grants with NCIS, and we're looking at criteria. And I'm wondering whether, for instance, somebody in the States paying somebody in England to go to the National Archives, whether that would be worth looking at as a valid research expense. How practical?
I say yes, because it was valuable to me. It's a lot cheaper than going yourself because you're not paying the airlines.
Yeah.
If you can avoid paying the airlines, full stop, do it. You know, that's where the money goes. And then once you get to London, of course, London is one of the most expensive cities in the world. So I know it's in Kew, it's not in London, but your lodging is not going to be dirt cheap by any means.
No.
So, you know, so with the hired researcher, you're just paying their hourly fee.
Yeah.
What I did was, you know, it's trite, but it's true. So, you know, so what I did when I needed somebody is I got in touch with a professor at Exeter that I had a connection to and I thought would know. And I said, hey, do you know anybody, thinking it's going to be one of her grad students, who would be interested in going to the Bristol Record Office and going to TNA and looking for material on these two guys in this time frame? And I had some online catalog references that I could throw at them. And she said, yeah, I got somebody for you. Well, long story short, yes, she was interested. Yes, she did it. I paid her with SNR funds, and that was the deal. We never even had to take the money out of England. We just, you know, SNR's in England. She was in England. We did a PayPal thing, and that was that. And it was wonderful because she sent me bunches of copies of stuff that she found. And then I had the leisure of just going through them and finding what I needed out of them. You know, I didn't have to. So with that, plus what I was able to get in terms of help from the archivist at Bristol, it worked out. I wasn't locked out of what I needed. But I would have been if I hadn't been able to pay Joanna $400 that I got from SNR from that little grant that they gave me. So I think it's a wonderful idea.
Okay, great. Joan, I don't know if we lost you at that point, but talking about future grants, and we've got a meeting on that next week, I think.
I heard that. Yes, I heard that. I didn't lose anything, so I just had to switch from one device to another.
All right. Any more questions from anybody? Yeah, Barbara.
Yeah. Phil, thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
At the risk of committing someone to something which I haven't even had a chance to think about, I have a friend who is a lawyer in London. He's an arbitrator with a background in shipping and international trade and commodities. and he's quite big in the field. Now, he wouldn't have the time to help you with this, but a targeted question, he has helped me with other unrelated things. Quite recently, I had a query about something completely unconnected. I wondered a targeted question might land on his desk and get an answer. And I wondered if there's any use to you in having a contact like that.
There could be, for sure. I can't think of anything immediately. But then again, I'm not there. I'm at sort of this point where I've got 2 articles I've got to finish that are just a matter of finishing them. And seeing where these grant apps go, if anywhere, to know if I'm going to be doing these projects or not. And at that point, then, you know, I'll be back into it. But right now, I am, you know, sort of in this mode of reading a really interesting book called Radical Uncertainty. If you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. And trying to get rid of my editor when he calls me, when he emails me and wants nitpicky information about images and stuff. By the way, as a total irrelevant aside, don't write books with illustrations. Make it all words because the rest of it's a pain. As soon as you have illustrations, you have lawyers. Anyway, that could be a very useful resource, and I will just file it in my brain. Thanks for bringing that up, because guys like that can definitely, guys like that and naval architects can be super, super useful to ask questions with. Despite the fact that their worlds are in today's maritime world, a lot of the stuff they know can be useful for sure.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. We have a question from Alistair Hart. If I could ask you to unmute yourself, Alistair.
Before he asks his question, I want to know, these look like the big ferries that we took from Nova Scotia to Newfoundland. So I want to know what these vessels are that are in his screensaver image here.
Well, it looks like he's in Scotland. Oh,
There
hi,
he is.
Alistair. There he is.
Sorry, you caught me out there. I was just finishing my pizza. No, if you can repeat what you said about the Nova Scotia ferries.
I wanted to know what the vessels are in the shot you have as your screensaver on Zoom, because they look like the big ferries that we took from Nova Scotia to Newfoundland.
Yeah, these are three passenger ships that were moored in KG5, King George V dock in Glasgow near Govan. And the names I'm struggling with, I think Azamara was one of them.
Azamara something.
Yeah, sorry, I think the owner was Azamara something. And they were there because of the pandemic. I mean, I've never seen any ship moored in KG5 for 30 years. And suddenly we had 3.
Wow. That reminds me of, there's a stunning photograph. I mean, there's tons of stunning photographs from the war, obviously, but this one just has stuck in my mind for 30 years. Here on the coast of North Carolina, we have 3 major capes, and they're primarily, especially the northern 2, they're recreation areas. They're national seashores. They're where people go summer vacation and, you know, sailing and fishing and all that sort of stuff. There's a bight behind Cape Lookout, big cove, and it has nothing to do with big commercial shipping. But during the war, once they finally decided that, oh, the U-boats are a threat, they're sinking our ships, they started finally doing the convoys up the East Coast. And there's a shot that we have of Cape Lookout Bight, which on any normal day, you would see a few small fishing boats in, you know, recreational fishing boats, some sailboats, birds, with probably 12 big tankers anchored in there, because that was one of their overnight stops where they would wait out the night before they went back out to go back up the East Coast. So yeah, it's always stunning when you see ships where they're not supposed to be.
Exactly, yes. Yeah. Yeah, my question was the reverse of your National Archive question. which just by coincidence I happened to visit last week, which was great, a fantastic day down there. But I'm also looking into the activities of the United States Army's Corps of Engineers and their involvement in building landing craft on the Clyde during World War II, prior to the D-Day landings, in fact. So we're talking about early 1944. And there is a little bit of information here in UK, in the Mitchell Library, for example, but the bulk of it, as it's the clues in the name, most of it is in the National Archives in the United States. And I have had some communication with those guys, but it's easy. I think it would be easier to find the Lost Ark in Steven Spielberg's warehouse than get through to where I want to be in the National Archives, because military records are notoriously detailed and scrupulous generally. I think the Americans made a special art of it. And I'm just wondering if you have researchers or consultants over there that could do that, look into that work for me, who already had a good grasp of how the National Archives work.
I have no doubt that there's an ample supply of them. And I might email me and I will email you a contact at ECU, because I think probably that might be the good conduit. That's naval stuff. I mean, it's not technically naval, it's Corps of Engineers, I get that, but there's so many connections between that department and work in Washington, that probably I'd say you'd have a good chance of finding somebody there, or somebody who knows somebody who's already in DC, that could do that. I do know my recent, I don't obviously have much call to deal with the National Archives here in the US, but my recent experience, I have had to about the George. And my experience was they are all the archives in the United States, and I'm sure this is the case overseas too. They're woefully behind because they had so many interruptions and during the Rona pandemic, that they're really trying to catch up with their correspondence, and they're very late. And they've told me, sorry for the 3-week delay or whatever in answering your email.
Yeah.
Their emails are great, their responses are great, but they're very, very delayed. And so I think a lot of it is they're trying to manage, so it's slow. And I do think that I can't imagine you would have any trouble finding somebody to do that. And knowing that they're going for Corps of Engineers records in that specific year, they're going to be able to get to that without too much issue. I have found in my own experience recently that National Archives staff in DC were very knowledgeable, very helpful, but it is huge. I mean, that place is mind-bogglingly huge. And so you got to get the right department. But fortunately for me, I was able to just write this ignorant email that, I didn't know, I don't know anything. And this woman was super helpful. She said, I need to get you to this department. I'm gonna send you there, but I'm gonna copy you and copy them. And she got me where I needed to be. And she's like, talk to this person, they're gonna know. And they didn't just dump me down the tube. They helped me. So that it's a matter of obviously getting to the right place, and I can't imagine that you don't already know enough. You already know enough to get them. So you should be able to get them to at least give you, this is what we have. And then as far as going through that stuff, I don't think you'll have a problem finding somebody to look at it for you for a reasonable rate. I think ECU might be a good conduit to that. If you want to email me, I will remember to, when I get that, I'll be like, oh yeah, that's what that's about. And I'll find somebody to patch you through to.
That would be great, because I think part of my
email address in the chat, please.
Yeah, that would be great if you don't mind.
Thank you very much.
Not to you,
Alistair.
Because I think just to finish it off with part of my angst in this is that I think the United States Army Corps of Engineers, when I see the structure of it and the projects they were involved in, I mean, they had so many projects in UK during the war. They built the Panama Canal. They built, dry docks globally. It's quite difficult to kind of pin down which division or platoon or whatever you want to call it was actually working in a particular place.
Right.
And all their records, if it's say platoon A, their records are in Washington. If it's platoon B, their records are somewhere else in another.
Right. Yeah. See, they don't have the
kind of thing.
space. They don't have the space to house everything. So but they know where their stuff is. It's just a matter of getting to the person who knows that collection and knows, oh, that's
exactly. Yes, exactly. So that would be great. Thank you for that assistance, Philip. That would be marvelous. Thank you.
Not a problem.
Thank you. And just an aside before I ask Shelby to give his next question, don't forget that NCIS is very happy to give letters to members, fully paid up members of NCIS, which gives them access to archives. Quite often people want some sort of sponsor, and we are very happy to do that for our members. I've just written one yesterday to give somebody access to a library in Madrid, and they needed the letter.
Right.
Otherwise they wouldn't be allowed in. So that's a good member benefit. Okay, Shelby, you have another question.
Yeah, I might add that if you're not a fully paid member, you don't get the full letter. It cuts off right in the middle. So I was
Actually,
just curious.
no, just leave their name blank.
I was curious as to whether you had looked at the work of Carlo Cipolla, the economic historian. Yeah, because I had read his Gun Sales and Empire, and this cat was just an elegant writer.
Yeah, he was.
Historian.
Yeah, it's that book, Gun Sales and Empires. In my racket, somebody would look at you real funny if they found out you hadn't read that. That's one of those that's core literature. And it's funny because I didn't read it. Just how it works. It's like your doctoral supervisor and your field people, they assign what they feel like they need to, and not everything's on the list, right? So I didn't actually read that until late, and I read it during independent dissertation research. I did not read it. It wasn't on my required lists when I was going through. And as I said, not everything can be, or you'd never finish. But it was just right, it's right there, core relevance. Yeah, he was definitely on about a lot of the same stuff.
So who was the author?
Carlo Cipolla.
Cipolla, Cipolla.
I'll spell it.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much. Okay, are there any more questions? Oh, thank you. Excellent. Put it in the chat. Any more questions? Well, we have covered so much ground, and really the nuts and bolts of research, which applies to all of us, access to archives, how to actually get our hands on the stuff. There's so much digitized now, but not everything. Sometimes you just have to get in there. I was up in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris last week, NCIS funded, thank you NCIS, and I looked for specific documents, but they tended to be in dossiers of lots of documents. And of course, I found really interesting documents that I'd never have thought of looking for. So getting your hands on the real stuff is amazing. So may I say thank you very much, Philip, for an incredibly interesting talk. Thank you to everybody for coming. Lovely to see you. And we will be in touch with details of future events. Our events program committee is meeting soon. So thank you very much. Could I ask you all to unmute, and can we give Philip a big hand to say thank you?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I enjoyed it. I appreciate the opportunity, and I wish everybody well and stay healthy, and hope to see all of you at least virtually soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Solid.
Goodbye.